Not many decades ago did people in Chicago bathe at public bathhouses and sleep outside on either their front lawns, rooftops, community parks, or the lakefront. Time was more especially hard for poorer people or immigrants of the city. And here's a short story taken from the specifics of a historical document of a Southern European Italian family who lived on the west side of Chicago at the turn of the 20th century, on a street named Koven Street, at a particular spot north of Roosevelt Road near Halsted Street that doesn't exist anymore. The building and the street that the building sat on are now under a highway and some parking lots. This neighborhood had a lot of Jewish families and Bohemian families in it, but not exclusively, but mostly at that time in that area. The street where we are specifically telling a story about a family was located on the same streets where the Great Chicago Fire had started in 1871 on Koven Street. This article is a description of an immigrant family in the year 1903 Chicago. It gives you a little bit of history of what it was like. So 2-year-old Teresa Annunziato sat munching a greasy breakfast of bacon, fried crisp and potatoes fried hard. Mary, her elder sister, who was 10 years older and grown up, had cut the bacon and potatoes for her. As she ate, she rubbed the fat, ground, greasy hands across her mouth and then across her forehead. Here's a knife. A dull knife eventually slices the bacon. Teresa had a sour look on her face. The bacon is going bad. There is no wind coming through that side window, and we don't see the sunrise from here, only brick walls. The brick was layered one brick at a time, and I could see the sweat marks on the mortar. But this bacon was sliced on the dirty table, and all the mouths knew it was coming. Salivating puddles evaporated onto the apron. It had been hot in the squalid little room where she and her sister Mary, and the other sister who was between Teresa and Mary, had slept on the hot bed. The brothers, there were 3 of them, had slept on the other bed. Dirty beds, plus the smell of ours echoed the footsteps. Sometimes they would sit on the floor, and some of the kids ate on the bed. There weren't enough chairs. There was a hole in the knot in the wood where one of the children dropped a toy, soon to be flooded with tears. The other kids gave the slightest care about that. Even hot in this narrow room, one window opened out toward a frame building. No air ever came through that window when the wind came from the west or south or north. It didn't matter when the wind came from the east. The east wind meant cool and comfort. For 3 days, there had been no east wind, and it had been getting hotter and hotter. Tonight, they would sleep on the wooden sidewalk in front of the house. So would all the people in the neighborhood. They would not stand another night in the stifling rooms. Some of the kids laid against the building, and everyone had their preferred spot to sleep outside. Some others picked a random new spot every night, and parents watched with approval. At first, they laid their heads in the hot air filled with the echoes of voices from the neighbors down the street, and some of the saloon drunks kept laughing all night. When are they going to finally give up? Well, they gave up a long time ago. Now we have to deal with them. There was a girl that sat in a window across the street. She would watch everything from her black beady eyes that sat at the bottom of the windowsill. And a couple of residents were overcome by the heat and died on September 8th in 1903. Henry North and Samuel Page, who lived at 112 Koven Street. They possessed some of the hands that built early Chicago, particularly on Franklin and Congress Streets at the time. Nobody will remember their names. Teresa's little body was red where the heat had brought a sore, irritating rash to its surface. She had tossed uneasily through the night and had kicked Sister Mary vigorously. It was early morning now, and she was more comfortable eating bacon and potatoes. Her one thin garment did not add to the heat of her body. Although the sun already baked the house, it was nothing to what was coming after a while. So kids are kids, and the streets knew them best. And some of them looked exhausted, but the sun was also their fuel. They drank from a dirty bucket, and some of the kids would spit out the last drink. People would watch from the side of their houses, and their faces were at every angle. Nobody would sit alone there. Yet there was hope. At any moment, the east wind might come. If it did not, they would not sleep on the board planks on the sidewalk, but in their beds. And they would be glad that they were three to a bed, because the east wind might cool them. Mother and Mary went out after the bacon and potatoes had been eaten. They had tidied up the place by placing the dirty dishes in a dirty sink where they could soak. And once in a while they would sweep, but not often. They would be back presently with bundles of half-finished garments on their heads. Then, as Teresa knew, they would sit during the day in the stifling room, close to the one window, and sew, while the light lasted and while the sun beat down on their house. They would sew new blankets, they would sew garments, they would sew the holes in their pants, they would sew everything. Their fingers were sweaty and tired, and bacon grease slipped on the needle. There were hours of silence spaced between the stories that they made up in their own head, but they would sew all the time. Outside was Teresa's world. It was from the streetcar tracks to the viaduct and back again. There was not even a green thing in it, not a tree, not a blade of grass, nothing but brick walls that radiated heat in the sunlight, nothing but dust in the streets, which burned their bare feet, nothing but planks on the sidewalks, which were warped dry by the heat. Then there was a saloon, well, two saloons, smelling of beer. Not a pleasant smell on a hot day when the beer had been poured on the floor and allowed to dry into a sugary dust. A bigger kid across the street locked another in the shed, and after he was freed, they complained to the other. The parents came to be witnesses of a Jewish man named Rosenblum, who studied in Poland before living in Chicago. He yelled at the older boy for locking the child in the shed on Koven Street. The kid got his older brother, who turned the words into blood and death. He killed the old Jewish man for sticking up for the child. The whole neighborhood saw it. Everybody was in the street. They witnessed it. The criminals ran and hid, but were later arrested. It wasn't the first time spending the night in jail. John Schletta was charged with murder and of also kicking Hyman Levy in the backside for standing in for his little brother. The saloons were hot and smelly, and laughter filled the air that sat on the old floor of blood-soaked planks. There was a big sense of community there. Everybody knew each other. Mostly everyone knew each other. They knew who to avoid also. They shook hands with the same people who later threw fists. Alcohol dulled their senses and blurred their crumbling logic. They worked all day for little money, and they were being held down and destroyed by a city that they were building. And as the sun came higher overhead, Teresa lost even the energy required to paddle in water in the trough. She curled up by the ash barrel in the shade of the building and dozed. And there she was found by her sister Angela and dragged complaining back into the house. Not because sister had any thought that Teresa should not curl up around the ash barrel, but because sister was peevish with the heat and wanted to do something about it. Mother gave the complaining baby and sister Angela a penny, and they went out to hunt up the watermelon man. He kept tempting them with dirty slices of watermelon under a dirty glass jar, a penny a slice. The heat of Koven Street can make a penny a slice of dirty watermelon the most appetizing thing in the world, next to a penny's worth of ice cream, which one may be purchased from the same man. An ice wagon came in sight, and the sisters went in pursuit of it. It stopped at a saloon, and both sister and Teresa got a handful of pieces which had fallen into the dirt. These pieces of ice were washed in the water trough and sucked, grateful bits of coolness while they lasted. Then they wished they had bought popcorn instead of watermelon. It lasted longer. They hunted up the popcorn man to look at the luxuries that they could not buy, and there an unexpected place of good fortune came their way. The popcorn man had broken a ball of the sticky sweet meal, and then he gave each child a handful of its delicacy. Turning the hard corns under their tender teeth, Teresa sought the ash barrel again, and sister not interfering. She fell into restless sleep, moaning occasionally. There she was found by the young woman from the settlement. And as the young woman picked up the baby, she said to herself, "If the east wind does not come soon, these babies will die. Just look at her poor little face. To Teresa's mother, she gave much advice, to which mother listened. But the young woman knew that the attention did not mean compliance. She said, Don't feed the baby bacon anymore. She said at last, I'll bring you some pasteurized milk tomorrow. And what pasteurized milk might be to Teresa's mother, she did not know. But whatever it was, she would take it if the lady brought it. Yes, she would take it. Take anything, and do anything the lady wished. Yes, it was hot, but the baby would live. Had not the other babies lived? Yes, but 4 of them died when they were Teresa's age. But Teresa would live. Somehow Teresa would live. Had not Mary and Angela lived and not the boys lived? Yes. It was hot, but tonight they would sleep on the roof or on the sidewalk, and it would not be so hot. The east wind might come. Angela knew whence it come. Across the viaduct and across the railroad tracks, across the river and across a city of great noises and many people was the lake. There was water and more water and more water and nothing beyond they see. Angela had seen it once, but Teresa never seen it. From out of the water came the east wind, the cooling, life-saving breeze that lasted and smelled and felt of water. The sun got down towards the west, and the short buildings were casting comfortless shadows in the street. Teresa laid as one dead on a board in the shadow. Angela and the boys still played in the street. Mother and Mary still sewed in the hot room, but Teresa lay and gasped. One could see the heat dancing in the sun rays against the brick wall, and the air was heavy as a woolen blanket, and it came down like one and smothered them. Angela brought a piece of ice and rubbed it over Teresa's forehead, finally giving it to her to swallow. That was a small bit of comfort, but short-lived, and it did not end the animation back into the small brown baby. Mother came out of the hot room and picked up the suffering Teresa, who cried and struggled in her arms. And once released, she crawled back to the board and lay back on her back sullenly. The mother sat and looked toward the east and wondered if the east wind would come in time. The other babies who had not lived had died like this. They had gasped out their lives in stifling heat. It was not a time which could be used for sewing, badly as time was needed for that. The mother left the house and plodded to the church of the Holy Guardian Angels. And in the cool of the sanctuary, she kneeled and prayed that the east wind might come and that Teresa might live. And by the time she had reached the house again, the men were coming home from work, some of them from their intercepting sewer in Stony Island Avenue. The sun had gone down, but the woolen blanket still hung over the houses. Teresa still lay on the board. As the hot night came on the neighboring women, who gathered with Teresa's mother at the gate and gossiped, talking about the heat, the street was filled with children who were strong and cared nothing for the hot days. Only Teresa rested, a limp and almost lifeless little brown mass, against her mother. She no longer fought against being held. Men and women sat along the curb, talking listlessly. 3/4 of them faced the east, looking almost without hope in the direction from which relief might come. On the roofs of the houses they lay outstretched, and darkness grew. The woolen blanket became heavier, and as the hours grew later, the people on the curb stretched themselves out where they had been sitting and fell into uneasy sleep. The sidewalks looked like sections of stricken field where the dead lay in heaps. Teresa did not sleep. She laid in a circle over her mother's arms, passive with open eyes. Mother had yielded to weariness and had fallen asleep on the sidewalk. The night wore out its weary hours, and even though Teresa had closed her eyes, one could not have told whether she was sleeping or dead, or if she was asleep, whether she'd ever wake again. The street was quiet and dead with its mass of heat-stricken humanity. Some people stood like guards in front of the saloons, others laid across the curb in wooden planks. Broken glass cradled the piles of dirt in its curves where the kids were playing tag. Some Jewish people sat in the houses teaching children and sat bored with their dirty faces. But suddenly there was a shout. A few sleepers raised themselves to their elbows. The blanket had been ripped and torn. The heat was being driven away. The sleepers aroused by the shouts of joy. The street was alive again. The east wind had come. Chill and cool air struck their fevered bodies with sobs of thanksgiving. Teresa's mother carried the baby into the house, and the wind that saves was killing the heat. Now, these are real events and real people and real temperature, streets, everything, buildings. They all existed. In Chicago in 1903. This is the history of them.